Welcome everyone to this event on intelligence operations in liberal democracies. What I want to do, I'm Mitt Regan, I'm a professor here at Georgetown Law. I'm also a senior fellow at the Stockdale Center on Ethical Leadership at the Naval Academy. What I want to do is very briefly just provide some context for this evening's event, then introduce our participants, after which we'll see an excerpt of a film by Carl Colby on his father, which raises some really interesting and provocative questions. And I urge you, if you haven't already, to see the entire film. It's really remarkable work. So, this is part of a project on intelligence ethics and one on counterterrorism ethics headed by Professor Seamus Miller, who's professor of philosophy at the Australian Graduate School of Policing and Security Studies at Charles Sturt University in Australia. Seamus has worked with police, military, and intelligence forces around the world. And as the subtitle of our program tonight indicates, we're focusing on the efficacy, the ethics, and the accountability of intelligence operations in liberal democracies. And these are values that have to be balanced, have to be negotiated to some extent because they can be in tension. So the demand of efficacy says the intelligence community, the IC, has a duty to obtain information so that a country can understand the environment that it's acting within, especially the threats that it faces. The demands of ethics recognize that other people don't want to provide this information generally. So the IC may well need to engage in deception, theft, coercion to obtain it, may need to prey on the vulnerabilities of those who have it, may need to convince people to betray their country. All these things in ordinary life we consider wrong, but how much does the duty of efficacy authorize the IC to engage in them? And is there any ethical guidance on how far it can go? And then finally, the demands of accountability say that citizens should have assurance that these tensions are being resolved in a way that's consistent with the values of a liberal democracy. If they're not, no country really can claim that it stands for anything other than its own self-interest in a fundamentally Hobbesian world. So that's the background for the event tonight. Our panelists tonight are superbly qualified to speak about these issues. I've introduced Seamus already, what he does. In addition to Seamus, we have Carl Colby, who's an award-winning documentary filmmaker, president of Carl Colby Films. His production credits include films about Franz Klein, Willem de Kooning, Bob Marley, Frank Gehry, George Morell, and an Emmy Award-winning film on Franco Zeffirelli. So quite a range of subjects and interests. Most relevant to our event this evening, Carl is the producer of the film The Man Nobody Knew, In Search of My Father, CIA Spy Master William Colby. He'll be showing an excerpt from the film of about 35 minutes this evening. It's a remarkably thoughtful and quite candid film that raises a host of complex questions about what his father did for a living. To my immediate right is Michael Morell, one of our most distinguished public servants. Michael served in the Central Intelligence Agency for 33 years. During that time, he twice served as acting director of the agency, served as deputy director, executive director, and as director of intelligence, the top position on the analytical side of the agency. He's the author of a wonderful book called The Great War of Our Time, an insider's account of the CIA's fight against terrorism from Al-Qaeda to ISIS. And I highly recommend this book. It's a tremendously thoughtful, balanced, and insightful account of his work. He's currently with Boston Global Strategies, and he's host of one of my favorite podcasts called Intelligence Matters. I've introduced Seamus. To the far left is Avril Haines. Avril served as assistant to the president and principal deputy national security advisor to President Obama, deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency, the first woman to hold that position, and legal advisor to the National Security Council. She's currently a deputy director of Columbia University World Project, a project of the president of the university, which defines its mission in this way: to connect academic work and the capacities of the university community with organizations and entities beyond the academy that possess the power and influence to transform research into concrete consequences benefiting humanity. Avril is also a lecturer at Columbia Law School. And I would be remiss, given the venue, if I didn't mention that Carl has an undergraduate degree from Georgetown, Michael has a master's degree, and Avril has a law degree from Georgetown. So welcome home to all of you. We couldn't find anyone who's a graduate of the medical school on site. So Carl will now screen a portion of his film that touches on some important issues relating to the complex nature of intelligence operations, after which we'll engage in a discussion. Yes.
There are some eerie allusions to today's world with
Yes.
the Hill and all, and which I'm sure the panel will discuss. I just want to say a couple of things. I think my father would have looked on affairs today as that it would be inconceivable to have the CIA without proper oversight. He would have taken that as a badge of honor that whatever he suffered personally and of the consequences of his firing and all, is that he did create or helped create an oversight process that is essential and vital to the relationship, which I'm sure Mike and Avril will speak about. And then the second thing is, I don't think he would have been too happy with the possible politicization of the intelligence community. I think he felt that they were loyal public servants and are left to do their jobs and not have the extra weight of some political concerns on top of them. And I'll leave it to the, if you had maybe a question to ask me.
Yes, Carl. First of all, this is a remarkable film, and you've only seen a portion of it. The film is obviously prompted by a deeply personal interest in pursuing the issues that you do. When you were done, what kind of assessment did you have of what your father did for a living, his professional life?
It's funny, we have a big family, but we never spoke about it. None of the siblings ever could talk to the others about what my father was doing. You just learned, it was almost like a private intercession. I remember once I was in Saigon and I'd been on the diving board at the Cercle Sportif Club where I spent every afternoon swimming. And a friend of mine, PJ, said, "Your dad's a spy." You know, I said, "What?" He said, "No, he works for CIA." I said, "No, he works for the embassy." No, he's CIA. And I went home and asked my father, I said, "You know, this guy told me that you work for the CIA. Is that true?" He goes, Then he reached over towards me and gave me a wry smile and said, "Let's just keep that our little secret." And I felt like whatever I could do to bolster his mission, then I was doing good work. I believed in him. I believed in his sacrifice, obviously from World War II and onward. But he was on a mission, and we were on that same mission with him. And yet my mother kept this standard, this moral compass which she spoke about. And that's how we were raised. And it was a tough slog, you know, towards the later years when Phoenix made the papers, as it were, and he's being compared to Heinrich Himmler. But I always believed in him. I believed that in his core, he was a Columbia University liberal Democrat, going door-to-door canvassing. He worshipped Roosevelt. He loved JFK. He was an idealist who took the fall.
Thank you, Carl.
Thank you, gentlemen. Lady, I'm sorry.
So, a lot to talk about. Let me just start by asking Michael and Avril. As we know, there are many things, as I said at the outset, that are necessary for an intelligence community to perform its mission that an ordinary life we would consider wrong. To what extent do you think that fact about what the IC does just affects the personal character of those who work within it? And how do they deal with this sort of tension, this, I think, inevitable and to some extent irresolvable tension?
So, I mean, the film is remarkable. Carl's amazing. I just want to say that I always saw Bill as, kind of in military terms, as the guy in his platoon who threw himself on a grenade to save everybody else. That's how I viewed Bill. One thing the film doesn't capture that you need to know was there was deep, deep frustration, anger inside CIA about what Bill was doing with the Congress. Thought it was wrong that Bill was telling the secrets. These are people who weren't aware politically of the need to tell the secrets in order to save the organization. And so not only did he have the media and commentators and members of Congress coming at him, but he had his own people coming at him. And I think his what he did at the end there, given all that, was remarkable. And I think speaks to, even today when we have the layers and layers and layers of oversight that I'm happy to talk about, that the character and the integrity of the people at the helm, whether it's the president, whether it's the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, or the Director of CIA or the DNI, really matters. And I think that's what comes through in this film for me. So I just wanted to say that. So I'm going to challenge your premise a little bit. I think there are parallels between finding aspects of one's personality or one's life that you want to use in order to get them to work for the United States as a spy, and say advertising, where you're looking for aspects of people's personality and their interests and how they think to sell them something. I mean, so I don't necessarily believe that the act of spying is somehow wrong, morally and ethically wrong, and you're somehow balancing it with the need to acquire secrets. I think it matters greatly how you do that. There are many nations in the world that use blackmail in order to get somebody to spy for them. Central Intelligence Agency does not do that. We look for positive incentives to get people to spy. Perhaps it's their children want to go to school in the United States. Perhaps they want to eventually come to the United States. Perhaps their mother needs special health care that they can't get in their own country. So you're looking for positive inducements. In some cases, you're willing to take away negative inducements. So the FBI and the CIA show up at your front door and say, we know you've been doing X. You have a choice right now of whether you're going to be arrested or whether you're willing to work with the CIA to spy for us. So we're willing to take away negative incentives, but we don't create them. We don't create them through blackmail. We know you've been cheating on your wife, and therefore we're going to let her know unless you spy for us. We don't do that. And we don't do it for two reasons. One reason is we don't think it's the right thing to do. We don't think it's morally right. But the other reason is that we'd much rather have a spy who is working for us because they want to, rather than because they have to.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, first of all, I joined Michael in complimenting the film. I think it's terrific. And part of what I think it's incredibly important to have discussions like this. And I think, frankly, what you're doing and bringing these issues together, I'm not somebody who, frankly, as Michael knows, enjoys doing podcasts or sort of coming out and speaking and discussing a lot of things publicly. I have to say, oh, sorry. For this one, it seems to me discussing the ethics of intelligence activities and discussing the ethics of government work, discussing ethics generally is incredibly important, and it's something that we need to spend more time on generally. So I start from that place. I think one of the lessons I draw from, in a sense, the Phoenix program or other things like this is how easy it is for people who believe that they're trying to do something that's right, that believe that they're pursuing what they believe to be, an objective with moral authority, as was described, can so easily go down a path that actually fundamentally undermines, essentially, the moral authority that they're trying to pursue in a way. And it is really challenging in these spaces to figure out what are the lines that you should be drawing. And I, personally, without the benefit of, sort of being a professor of philosophy and thinking through these things in a really academic, rigorous way, I have, first of all, recognized that I have constantly been evolving in my own thinking about these issues and suspect I will continue to do so over time. But I've thought about it in a way as different layers of ethical issues. So I'm sure this is not comprehensive, but the way I've thought about it is there's a sort of a personal ethics kind of evaluation that you do. There's a professional ethics evaluation that you do. There's an institutional ethics evaluation that you do. And then there's a sort of societal ethics piece. And frequently what I found is that in thinking through these different spheres that interact with each other, there are tensions between them. What I think about for my personal ethics may be that I want to be honest for the most part, but I'm not always going to be honest. I'm not going to tell my husband that I really don't love the gifts that he's given me, or, I'm going to have some spaces in which I make decisions about, where I'm drawing my own lines. In my professional ethics, I may decide there's no space for, white lies, or, because I believe that it's so important to and the character of and the credibility of my work, or I think as a lawyer, I owe a certain allegiance to, a particular ethical and integrity standard on issues. Institutionally, I think of it as the culture of the institution. I think about the fact that from an institutional perspective, you have to think about the ethics of what you're doing. There's a whole series of things that are packed into that, and the societal ethics are really what get, I think, in many respects to the question that you're asking, which is to say that, it's not just in intelligence work, it's in a series of governmental activities that you do things that are inconsistent with what people would consider personally, ethically acceptable, right? So you're in a conflict and you're killing somebody else. That's clearly a violation of the law in another country. That's clearly an ethical issue. And yet, as a society, you have taken the decision that you're going to war, and you may have decided it's in the context of a self-defense and it's an appropriate thing to do, and you've made these decisions about how it is you're going to do it. But the reality is, even within those spaces, you're still creating frameworks and thinking about what is within the lines and what's outside of the lines. And certainly that's true, as Michael's comments, I think, indicate, in intelligence activities. We think about what is the line to draw. So you can, lie to somebody else under certain circumstances, but when is it appropriate? When isn't it appropriate? Why is it appropriate? All of those things are going to be a part of the discussion, and they have to be a part of the discussion. And it's a particularly challenging thing, I think, to unpack each of these, because you end up getting into the gray spaces that are really the most challenging aspects of things, but it's very hard to create rules that are going to give you the answers to these issues, obviously, across the board.
Can I just add one thing?
Please, yes.
I just want to add to the structure that Avril has started here, which I think is terrific. Let me just give you another dimension. So I think there are 3 different activities that the intelligence community undertakes that have different ethical issues attached to them. So the first is analysis, and there is an ethics of analysis that doesn't get talked about enough, that doesn't get discussed enough, needs to be discussed more. There's an ethics of intelligence collection and a particular set of ethics around human collection, because you are using another human being. And then there's a set of ethics around covert action. And I think you can make a nice little matrix with Avril's four layers of ethics and these 3 sets of activities in which the ethics are fundamentally different in each case.
That's very interesting. Before I turn to Seamus, Michael, let me ask you, since you spent so much time with the agency. Avril talked about organizational cultures, and we know how powerful those are, the way they transmit norms. How does the agency develop norms and transmit them, given the very challenging kinds of situations that Avril described?
So it's a great question. Let me take the area I know best, which is analysis. The ethics of intelligence analysis really spin around 3 things. They spin around making your analytic judgments independent of politics and policy. Independent of your own politics and your own policy views, and certainly independent of anybody else's. That's 1. 2 is to, once made, to have the fortitude and the integrity to stand behind those judgments in the face of people challenging them. Most of the times for legitimate reasons. But then that gets you to the third is sometimes you are dealing with policymakers who are challenging you for political reasons, who want a particular answer. And the ethics of standing up to that pressure and doing the right thing at that moment. So those three aspects of the culture of analysis are taught in the earliest classes to the most advanced classes that CIA teaches. But more importantly, they're taught every day on the job. They're talked about. Historical cases are discussed. There's an understanding among not only the analysts, but the organization itself, and even policymakers who have been in the business for a long time, that is the ethic. And don't mess around with it. And so it becomes the heart of who the analysts are, because it is there from day 1 through the last day that they're on the job. And it also gets reinforced by stories and things that happen. The most significant attempt at politicization that I saw was by Vice President Cheney's office in the run-up to the Iraq War, when they wanted us to say that there was an operational link between the Iraqi intelligence service and Al-Qaeda. And we did not see it that way, and we wrote a paper that said there is no operational relationship here. There never has been one. There was no Iraqi involvement in 9/11. There was no Iraqi foreknowledge of 9/11. And we got a call from the Vice President's National Security Advisor, who told us to withdraw the paper. And the head of analysis at the time stood up and said, "If I have to do that, I'm resigning." 2 weeks later, she saw the president, and the president said, "Hey, Jamie, I know about this nonsense that's going on between the vice president's office and you guys over your judgment on Iraq and Al-Qaeda. And I just want you to know that I want you to call it like you see it. I want you to ignore that pressure. I have your back." That story spread like wildfire across the agency and reinforced that culture that I'm talking about. So that's how it works.
So Seamus, you're a philosopher who thinks a lot about ethics and also has the benefit of working with, again, military, police, intelligence agencies. What kind of perspective do you bring to this? What sort of framework do you think is helpful in thinking about these issues?
I should say I don't have the benefit of being in the CIA or a legal background, so we've all got our crosses to bear here. Yeah, so there's at least two different sort of categories of ethical problem. I mean, the one that Mike has just mentioned, the independence issue, this is not really one that's of the kind that Mitt was talking about earlier, where Avril was talking about in terms of killing people, or lying, or betraying people. You're not doing anything wrong in ordinary life if you speak the truth to power, if you tell people what they need to hear. It may take moral courage and so on, but I think the more problematic cases, as of course in the case of some covert action and so on, is where you're doing something harmful to someone. In fact, you may even be doing something harmful to someone who's perfectly innocent. For example, in cases of intrusive surveillance, or where you've got false information. So, unfortunately, in policing, in intelligence work, in the military, there's certain sorts of harmful methods which are necessary, and this creates a moral problem, potential moral problem. So the tricky part is to think through those issues so that ultimately, even though you're using harmful methods, even though people are being harmed in serious ways, nevertheless what you're doing is justified. Okay, so how do we distinguish between someone who's torturing someone because for a good end, or someone or a police officer who's loading up a suspect for a good end, and what we regard as morally justifiable action, and action that that person can live with, and that organisation can instill. And I think that there are kind of three kind of principles. One is that the action better be objectively justified. Secondly, that it ought to be such that it's lawful, ideally, so that you comply with the law. And the third thing is that the community generally is prepared to accept it. If you can meet those three tests, you might just be performing action which, although it's harmful, is action you can live with, and which the community can live with.
Great, thank you. David Oman, who was former head of the UK's GCHQ, which is the major signals intelligence agency in the UK, was at a workshop we held this summer in Oxford, and he has suggested that intelligence agencies, for better or for worse, like it or not, now have to deal with an increasing demand for transparency as a condition of what he calls their license to operate. First of all, do you agree with that? And second, how can agencies, if that is the case, how can agencies accommodate this demand and still maintain the secrecy that they need to maintain in order to do their job effectively?
So I agree 100%. I think that historically, the intelligence community, certainly my agency, has held things too close to the vest. You saw with Bill Colby a major step forward, right? And at least talking to Congress about those things. But I've long felt that there is more room for the leadership of the intelligence community, the leadership of the agency, to talk to the public more about what it does and why it does it, why it's important. And I actually believe that by pushing the fence line out in what you talk about, you can not only better inform the American people and get them more comfortable with what you are doing, a secret intelligence organization in a democratic society, but you can also do a better job protecting the secrets you have to protect by pushing that fence line out. I really believe that. And I think I think we were heading in that direction. I think that was something that we saw certainly in the second half of the Bush administration and then throughout the Obama administration, that intelligence leaders would be frequently out talking to the public. At universities, at think tanks, sometimes on TV, although I don't think that's necessarily a good place to do it because it's too political, but certainly we're getting out there and talking to people, and that was a good thing. And I think one of the terrible consequences of politics in this town at this moment is it has sent our intelligence leadership to ground. They are not out there speaking publicly. And they're not out there speaking publicly because when they're out speaking publicly, they have to make a choice. Do I answer the question the way that my building believes the answer is, or do I answer it the way my boss wants the answer to be? And if I choose one or the other, I'm going to get in trouble. And so they have gone to ground. Current director of CIA has spoken twice publicly, and in both cases, the questions during the Q&A period had to be written down on a piece of paper, and then they chose which ones to ask her. Not exactly fair game. So I think, we're not in the right place at the moment. Hopefully we'll get back to the right place, and we'll get a president who understands the importance of all this, and we'll get intelligence community leadership who also understands what you just said.
Yeah. So I absolutely agree with everything Michael said, and I guess the only thing I'd add to it is as follows. I think there are definitely ways to do it that are credible and that are consistent with even the CIA's mission. I think talking about the structure within which you are conducting activities is different than talking about the details of those activities. And what I found is that in our time in government, it just consistently, when the president wanted to describe or discuss an area, it was possible to get to the level of generality that you could still have a serious conversation about the issues, the kinds of things that the public would want to engage in, about why it is that we're doing X versus Y, and how we're doing it, and why is it consistent with our values, and and what we believe to be in the interest of the country, and so on, without actually revealing details. But it's hard, and institutionally, we are set up to incentivize an extraordinary amount of classification and not incentivized to declassify. And just structurally, that has been a consistent issue that I've seen as a challenge to what you're describing. I did see people recognize just what Michael said, which is that there is real value, even if you're just focused on your national security mission and you're thinking about, the activities of the agency, for example, that people started to recognize the value of actually talking about it, because it actually can legitimize it in ways that make it more possible to do your work, right? And that's useful. But there's obviously another side to this, which is that if you live in a democracy and you're not actually talking about what the key issues are in engaging uses of force, for example, or a whole series of other things that are important, to fundamentally prosecuting your national security and foreign policy strategy, then you're not really able to have a conversation in the public about things that are incredibly important to what you're making decisions on in terms of who you want to elect for president or for Congress or other things like that. So it's really, I think, fundamental to our democracy to push ourselves as much as possible to get out and have those discussions. And finally, through the process of exposing it, you learn something. I think there's this sense of, getting an opportunity to hear from other people, other stakeholders, folks who aren't in the government, who have different perspectives and views and how they see things, and airing it out in that way tends to change how it is that you're doing things. And I think that's a valuable process as well.
Go ahead, Seamus.
Yeah, so, clearly, as has been said, you need a level of secrecy if you're going to conduct espionage and so on, both in relation to not simply the people and particular operations, but the methods and so on. But on the other hand, it's also clear that, one of the things the Colby thing I think brought out was we don't want people doing certain things under cloak of secrecy that engaged in unwarranted assassinations and so on and so forth. So there has to be a level of transparency. So one issue there is that the public at large is presumably entitled to know is what are as you say, some kind of general types of things that are going on, and are they acceptable to the public? That's one kind of issue. Another kind of issue that may be possible to have, for example, some oversight or some input into the decision making by, say, some of the legislators, and therefore the representatives of the people, in the context of some of these, in the US context, I guess, through these Senate and House Intelligence Committees. So that's another way that you can be part of the process. But there seems to be a more general issue here, which is, so we're trying to kind of, on the one hand you need secrecy, and on the other hand you need obviously a degree of transparency. But I think one of the larger principles that has to get on the table to settle where the line is going to be drawn, it comes back to what are the sort of legitimate purposes of these intel agencies. And if, for example, I mean, and so I don't think people would argue too much if you're talking about clear cases of national defence or defence against terrorist groups. You need the level of secrecy has to be such that the operations that have to be conducted are not compromised. So, but I think one of the things that seems to be happening, and I think this is actually in the current national intelligence plan, is a slippage from national security, which hopefully is to be understood reasonably narrowly, to national interest. National interest seems to be a much broader kind of notion, and would license a lot of activity that really is kind of questionable. But at any rate, where you draw the line is to some extent a matter of what you take the basic purposes, moral purposes actually, if we're talking about defence.
Can I jump in? You probably want to go someplace else, but
No. Go wherever you want to go.
I just wanted to pick up on what everybody said so far and make a point about covert action, which I think where most people think the rub is, but it's not really. When I go to universities and talk to students, I always get asked about torture. I always get asked about enhanced interrogation. Always. Never fails. And this is what I say to them. I say, I am happy to talk about that as long as you want to talk about it. I will talk to you about it for hours. I'll go as deep with you as I can without revealing anything classified. Most of it's now unclassified. But in order for us to have that conversation, you have to accept something. You have to accept a proposition. And the proposition you have to accept is that the enhanced interrogation program was not CIA's program. It was a program of the United States of America. Why do I say that? Yes, CIA carried it out, but it was directed by the president. It was approved by the National Security Team. It was approved by the Department of Justice as being legal, and it was briefed to the leadership of the two intelligence committees, all of whom approved it. This is America's program. This is what the overstrike structure gives you. And this makes it America's program, which means that the ethics are on all of those people involved in that process, not just at CIA. And I think it's really, really important for everybody to understand that. I think there are some specific ethical issues that fall on the leadership of CIA in the case of covert action, but it's not the CIA that's making the judgment about the balance here between doing something improper in defense of the nation. That's the president's decision, and that's Congress's decision at the end of the day. It's not the director of CIA's. So I think the real issues the real ethical issues for the leadership of CIA come down to the operational side of the agency and how we conduct ourselves and what we're willing to do and what we're not willing to do, and what are the written rules, what are the rules that pop up when a new issue pops up. I mean, I had during my time as deputy director and acting director, I had people come into my office and say, here's something we want to do, and it just didn't feel quite right to me. There's a little feeling in my stomach that this is not the right thing to do, and I would tell them to find another way. You guys are really smart, go find another way. And so I think it's on those operational issues where the leadership of CIA is really making the decision about the value of doing something that may not quite be right, may not quite feel right, versus the benefit you get to the defense of the nation.
So let me just follow up on that, Michael, and ask, given the agency is tasked by policymakers and directly elected officials, right, to do something. If there is a judgment that something is legal, does that really end the conversation, do you think?
No, it doesn't at all. It doesn't. That's a great question. So I don't know how many of you read Mike Hayden's book, Playing to the Edge. I think the world of Mike Hayden. I really do, but I think the argument in his book that the intelligence community has the responsibility to play to the legal edge and to fill that whole box is not quite right. I mean, Mike says the intelligence community has a responsibility to get chalk on its cleats, right, as it defends the nation, to stay within that legal box. Stay within the box, but use the whole box. I think he's missing two really important points. One is there is a legal box, but inside the legal box is a policy box drawn by the President of the United States and drawn by the United States Congress. And then inside of that box is your own personal ethics or your own organizational ethics. So there's certain things that CIA won't do, for example, like use reporters as cover for our officers. It's an organizational decision we made years ago because we didn't want to put reporters at risk. There's no statute that says that. That's an organizational regulation. So I lost my train of thought.
But you made a very good point.
Anyway, I'll stop.
Can I?
Yeah, Avril?
Because this is a particular pet peeve of mine. The law is not intended to mark out the moral sphere within which you should operate, right? It is so frustrating that it, in some circumstances, seems to be considered synonymous with morality, right? Where you sort of say, just because it's legal, well, then it must be okay. And it's definitely not the case, right? And so that I think is one of those things that culturally we need to rework, so to speak, in this context and think that through. I also think one of the challenges is if you've got, if you have a program, right, that authorizes activity that you personally believe to be immoral, right, and if you're somebody who's looking at that program in retrospect, right, like sort of looking at it from an accountability perspective and saying, you know, what is acceptable and how should we have done this differently and what have we thought about in this context? In a sense, as you're asking, I think there are a series of categories of issues that, at least from my perspective, you have to think through in different ways. One is there are people who may have acted outside of the scope of the program, right? In other words, who didn't act consistent with whatever the rules were for the program. That is obviously an issue, and that's something that has to be addressed, right? Then there are folks within the program, and you know, this relates to something that Michael said. I would hope that if I were in a circumstance in which I was working in an agency under a program and I was told to do X, Y, and Z, and I thought it was immoral and not consistent with my personal ethical code, that I would say no. But I have to say, I think that's awfully easy for me to say outside of the box, right? Not being in the situation, not understanding the pressures, also recognizing that particularly in, you know, covert programs or in other circumstances, you don't see the full picture, right? Like you see your piece of the picture. And you're operating under a whole series of other pressures, and you're watching people who mentored you or that you respected do things and so on. And part of what is challenging in that space from my perspective is a few things. One is the culture of the institution. So going back to what you were saying, I think the degree to which you have the room to ask questions and to dissent and raise issues without it being sort of, you know, raising it to DEFCON 5 and, you know, having to pull out kind of thing is important. And it's a reason to have a culture that allows people to do that so that when they get into these circumstances and you're getting into gray zones, you give people the opportunity to do that. I think additionally, to the point that Michael made, it should give you extraordinary pause as a policymaker who is authorizing such programs, the position that you're putting the people who are going to be in those programs in. Because if you are authorizing a program that is, you know, putting chalk on the chalk line, sorry, I'm really bad with sports metaphors, but in any event. Like,
Chalk on the cleats.
Thank you, chalk on the cleats, sorry. And you are essentially authorizing something where a whole series of people will be involved in that program, even if they don't get close to the issues that that are sort of at the edge of what people may consider to be moral or immoral under those circumstances and may cross a line, you're essentially requiring folks who have no idea, right, like how they're participating in and facilitating that program. You're allowing them to be a part of it. And ultimately, at the end of the day, when they learn what the program is all about, right, they are going to have to live with the fact that they were part of that program and that that was something that they participated in and facilitated. And they didn't necessarily have the full picture, right? So they're trusting your judgment, basically, to have authorized it properly, to have thought through those kinds of issues, to have dealt with all of those things at your level because you have the perspective that they don't. And you're really doing an extraordinary disservice to those people if you don't exercise judgment in a way that you think is going to be appropriate and will ultimately be to the benefit of the reputation of both the agency and the country in the long term. And I think that's just something that, from my perspective, we don't spend enough time thinking about the folks who are authorizing these issues and really the ethics that they should be bringing to those decisions.
Well, yeah, I very much agree with what Avril's been saying. I mean, the law is not the same thing as morality, and sometimes they come apart. And indeed, often laws are defective for the simple reason that they don't reflect morality and they need to be changed. I mean, there were, if you think of the regime such as the Nazi regime, the South African regime, we've had all sorts of structures of laws that need to be, or slavery, etc., etc., etc. So you never want to get the view that the law is necessarily one with morality is pretty clearly false. The other point is that just because everyone around you, and whether it's the president, the government, the head of your organisation, says that has authorised this, that doesn't necessarily make it right. I mean, as the say in the Bible, "Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do wrong." So again, there is that point. The other sort of point is that unfortunately sometimes people may be called upon, far from sort of pushing the envelope and exacting as much as you can within the law. You may actually be called upon at times, given the deficiencies of laws, maybe that you may have to think hard about this and may have to actually break the law. So I think that has to be kept in mind as well.
So let me shift to a slightly different area now, but one that I think is still certainly related to ethical issues. I mean, it's been axiomatic that national intelligence agencies' obligation is to the states that they serve. Former CIA Director Webster said, "In the United States, we obey the laws of the United States. Abroad, we uphold the national security of the United States." In recent years, there have been some who argue that all individuals, wherever they may happen to live, have a basic right to, say, privacy that should constrain what a national intelligence agency does. Do you think that's the case? Should that be the case? Are intelligence agencies now being held to that sort of standard?
You asking?
I'm asking.
So I'm going to say no, but let somebody, if somebody's going to say yes, let them make the argument and then.
Well, again, going back to David Oman has suggested that, again, this seems to be one of those emerging sets of expectations that, again, whether like it or not, for better or for worse, there may be emerging these sort of expectations that sort of encoded at this point. But I'm just curious your thoughts on. I mean, could an intelligence agency operate?
No, it could not. It could not.
So
if I had to get a FISA warrant to spy on non-U.S. persons overseas, I have to get a FISA warrant, right, to spy on anybody in the United States. whether U.S. person or non-U.S. person. But if I had to get a FISA warrant to spy on non-U.S. persons outside the United States, it would shut the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency down. And it makes absolutely no sense. You're telling me that I have to get a FISA warrant to spy on an ISIS leader planning to attack the United States? I don't think so.
So Avril, yeah, I know President Obama took some steps that provided some, or meant to provide some kind of assurance that the United States would abide by certain principles or measures. Maybe you could describe those and your sense of whether that reflects the sort of thing that I described.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I fully, I mean, it's, I think the devil's in the details of what we're describing. For example, from a privacy perspective, there's no question that, forgotten which PPD number it was, but
yeah.
We did one obviously on the intelligence activities and on SIGINT in particular, and it reflects the fact that we do have concerns about privacy of foreign citizens, and it's not simply about U.S. citizens, and but it's certainly not equivalent in, for some of the reasons that Michael just noted. It nevertheless is something that you do want to think about, and I mean, I think there's no question that we need to push ourselves to do that in a variety of different ways. I mean, I think the fact that we're now looking at homomorphic encryption as a way of potentially maintaining the encryption of information and being able to, essentially search it in an encrypted way so that you don't actually have access to information is a way in which you can do the, protection of foreign citizen information.
Right, and I think the suggestion is not that there ought to be the equivalent sort of regime that there is under, say FISA, but that there are some minimal constraints. And again, President Obama was sensitive to this, obviously, and that presumably comes out of Snowden revelations or other kinds of publicity. Seamus, did you?
Yeah. Well, I think if we go back to first sort of principles again, I mean, I take it that the US and the UK and the EU and these countries believe in human rights. But unfortunately, whether those rights are rights to autonomy, right to life, right to privacy, those rights don't stop at the American border. The individuals in China and any of these other countries also have rights. So that's one issue. Of course, it's also equally true that if you happen to be a member of Al-Qaeda and you're busy in the business of murdering people, then you've just probably done enough to forfeit pretty much all your rights. So, but I think if you took it, so you do have to give some weight to the rights of people known to be innocent, whether they happen to be Americans and you are an American agency or, but as you say, I mean, there were 2 points there. The first thing is that I take it that the American security apparatus, its principal obligation is to the American people. It has other obligations to other people, but its principal purpose, if you like, it rightly has a partial, there's a partiality. It's not entirely impartial. It's looking after the security. That's its first commitment, and that's going to make a difference, presumably, in terms of these activities. The other thing is obviously the point that Mike's making. I mean, if there's some sort of apparatus, judicial or otherwise, which is going to render the whole thing feasible, then that's a pretty important consideration.
I do think this happened in the Obama administration. Just because you can do it, right? Just because the Fourth Amendment does not apply to non-U.S. persons outside the United States doesn't mean you should, right? And I think one of the things that we found when I served on President Obama's, I forget what the name was, but it was essentially the Snowden Commission. One of the things we found was that NSA was spying in some cases, not because they should have been spying, but because they could. They had developed these amazing capabilities and they were applying them. And I think one of the things that came out of our work on the commission that President Obama accepted, and I presume put in practice, was, look, when we're gonna make a decision to spy on an ally, for example, that's a decision that's gonna be made at the policy level and not at the intelligence level. So it is, at the end of the day, situational when it comes to who you spy on and how you do it. And some of those decisions can be made at lower levels in the intelligence agent community, some at the leadership level, and some should go absolutely to the policy level.
So one other phenomenon that seems to be increasing and that seems to be perhaps irreversible is leaks. Leaks of sensitive information seem to be more common. How can the IC live in a world that that has that feature? When things are supposed to be kept secret, yet so much is now in the public domain.
So I'd say that this is a long-standing problem. There have always been leaks. I'm not sure there's any more leaks today than there were, say, 25 years ago. I think what's changed is the volume that is in any one given leak because of technology. So it used to be maybe 1 or 2 documents that were leaked, and now it's billions and billions of pieces of data that get leaked. So I think that's the issue. I think that and the way the community's always dealt with it is by being prepared to change how you acquire intelligence. Being agile enough and nimble enough to change how you do something if something gets leaked and you lose a source or you lose a method by which you acquire that intelligence. I also think that it's extraordinarily important, this is going to sound strange coming from me, it's extraordinarily important for the intelligence community to have a good relationship with the media. I worked very hard, and the directors that I worked under worked very hard to have a good relationship with the media, to have off-the-record conversations with them, to get to know them, to get to understand each other, to get comfort with each other, to trust each other, to use Judge Webster's word, so that when there is an issue and you call them and you say, please don't publish that for the following reasons, they have some confidence in that they feel, you have some credibility when you ask them that question. And I think that gets overlooked. I think that's another damage of what's happening today, is I think there's a lot less communication between the intelligence community and the media for the same reason I talked about earlier. There was plenty of times where I had to pick up the phone and call an editor or a publisher and ask them not to publish something, and if I didn't have that relationship with them, I don't think I would have been successful, and I was successful most of the time.
So let me just go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say, presumably, when you talk about leaks, you're not talking about disclosures through proper channels of wrongdoing.
Talking about WikiLeaks.
Yeah, I mean, so it's unauthorized and unjustified leaks is essentially what it is. I mean, so one thing there is a lot of these organisations, there seems to be a degree of politicisation. An organisation with a lot of which is politicised and there are factions doing this, that, and other, maybe seeking advantage, or you've got a pretty unhappy workforce. I mean, I think you have to look at, if you've got a real problem with leaks, you've got to ask yourself, why is this going on? These people seem to be disloyal, or they're fighting one another, or it's politicised, or another issue might simply be that you don't have adequate accountability so that people, you don't have audits going on that they're going to make sure that people who leak are nailed. So, it's a general point.
So I want to just close with a couple of questions, and one is we talked about organizational culture and its importance in transmitting norms. The agency and the IC generally relies fairly substantially on private contractors. Is that a challenge in inculcating those norms? And Is that reliance, let me put it this way, is there a particular particularly valuable function that they perform, or is that simply a matter of necessity because of resources and workload? So what's the role of those contractors, and how should we think about them?
Want me to start? Oh.
Sure.
I don't see the concept of contractors as necessarily somehow denigrating our ability to inculcate those kinds of norms. So I wouldn't attach that. I think there are challenges with having a lot of contractors, that one could go through in a sort of separate thing. But frankly, there are a lot of contractors who are folks that worked at the agency for years and come back, after retirement to do special jobs because they have expertise or knowledge or experience that is relevant and important. There's a whole series of reasons and different sort of categories of folks that do this. So I don't see that as a particularly challenging piece to that. I do see leadership as being fundamental to this issue. So to really kind of creating the culture that allows you to effectively promulgate the kinds of norms that you're describing. And I think, I sort of expect that you're thinking about what is the kind of ethics training and that one should have in agencies generally. And I think across the U.S. government, I've worked in a lot of different parts of the U.S. government. None of them have really had sort of, what I would consider probably best practice ethics training, in the sense that it really wasn't integrated across the board in a whole series of ways that you think it might be. And frankly, I think that's true not just in government, but across our society in a variety of sectors. So I think that is an issue, and it's a critical aspect of this. But it's certainly not, I think that's important but not sufficient to sort of get to where you need to get to in this, because I really do see leadership as being critical to developing the kind of culture that both emphasizes ethics and these issues in the context of every issue that's coming up, but also gives you the space to have those discussions on your own and to think through those questions. And honestly, I was very lucky to have colleagues like Mike, but also so many others and bosses who really did think about those issues and made space for that. And I can't tell you how many times I realized, looking back, and even in those moments, I recognized how critical that was to really being able to surface those questions.
Couldn't agree more.
To add to that?
The only thing I would add is the reason they exist, the reason there's so many contractors who come to work every day and do exactly what government employees do, is because Congress, after 9/11, didn't raise the ceiling high enough. So in 1991, CIA had X employees. I can't tell you how many is classified, but in 1991 they had X. In 2001 they had 0.75X. When I walked out the door in 2013, it was 1.1X. So you're just back to where you were in 1991 in a world that was much, much, much more complicated and much, much more dangerous and required much, much more intelligence work. And how did you fill that gap? You filled it with contractors.
I don't know which task you're talking about contract. I mean, there's obviously issues around private military companies in terms of.
Well, I'm talking about people like Edward Snowden.
Oh, okay, right. Yeah.
So let me close with a question for Michael and Avril, to sort of an open-ended question. And leaving aside the very large elephant in the room of the current political climate and the current administration, frankly, what do you see as the major challenges of the intelligence community going forward? Assuming we can get through this period reasonably intact, which may be a heroic assumption, and that creates its own challenges. But I'm interested just looking ahead. What do you see on the horizon? Michael, you've spent more than 30 years in that community, and let me direct the question first to you.
So I'd say technology. I'd say figuring out how to get the community to the cutting edge of technology and keeping it there. In a world where technology is changing extraordinarily rapidly and at an increasing rate, and where the vast majority of that technology is developed in the private sector, and where a significant amount of that technology is developed outside the United States. How do you do that? It's extraordinarily important because there's sort of two effects in one thing you have to add on to that. The two effects are, one, the technology does two things to you, to your organization, right? It makes more difficult what you do to collect intelligence. So you can imagine what biometrics and facial technology do to the ability of people to travel in aliens. But it also creates opportunities for you to do your job. And you got to be prepared to take advantage of those opportunities. The second effect it has is it has a tendency to level the playing field with your adversaries. So your adversaries have access to all this technology, and they're going to use it. Just 10 years ago, there were probably 3 or 4 countries in the world who had the ability to take imagery from space. Now there are dozens and dozens and dozens. And that's a leveling of the playing field, and how do you deal with that from a defense perspective? And I think the third thing, which we don't think about enough, is I can go to the agency right now and I can put together a group of people around a table who can give you world-class analysis on the Iranian nuclear program, or the North Korean nuclear program, or the North Korean ICBM program, or Chinese military modernization. I don't think I can do that with regard to where the Chinese are on AI, or where the Chinese are on nanotechnology. I don't think the community has that capability today, and it needs to. It needs to be able to have the same world-class expertise in those things that it has in the traditional threats that we have faced. And so I'd say technology.
Really?
Yeah, there's not much I can add. The one, maybe just to build on, one of the things that it seems to me the intelligence community can do and has done very effectively is serve as an interlocutor outside of policy channels with other countries to really lay down the landscape of what's happening in a certain area so that the policymakers in those, in our country and in the other country can have a better conversation, right? So in other words, whether it's in the context of the JCPOA, and so what is Iran doing in terms of its nuclear program type of thing, or it's about, a variety of different things, what's happening with China and the South China Sea or other things like that. And in order for that to happen, you really need the intelligence community to be perceived as separate from policy and as a credible and sort of, somebody, an institution essentially that is laying down the facts and trying to provide the analysis in an objective way. And I think that's an important piece of the picture that I saw as being a way to fuel and to promote U.S. foreign policy and national security that I think we need to preserve. And I worry about the politicization, to your sort of original question that we're engaged in right now that really makes it more challenging, I think, to perceive any part of the government as being outside of that realm and legitimate from that perspective.
Great, well, thank you. I've kept you longer than I promised, so I want to thank you for that. First of all, I want to thank Carl for screening a portion of his remarkable film. And again, I urge you to see it all. I want to thank Michael, Seamus, and Avril for their really thoughtful comments in dealing with these really complex and difficult questions. So please join me.